Margaret, thank you. That was such a generous introduction. I'm not certain that anyone in my family would have recognized me from that. And thank you and PathNorth for this opportunity to speak about a pretty important topic. And before I get into that, let me just extend an invitation for you to come back to the cathedral. On September 30th, John Meacham is going to be our guest preacher and speaker at a forum, and you may know that he has recently published a book, The Soul of America. So I commend that to you. On October 3rd, we will be launching the first of an ongoing series called Honest to God, where people in public life come together to talk about some of the hard issues in our country and how they tackle them as a person of faith. And for our first gathering, Secretary Madeleine Albright will be joined by Rabbi David Saperstein and moderator David Brooks. So that's October 3rd. And then finally, October 16th is our annual Ignatius Forum. And the topic this year is going to be on corporate activism. And Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, and maybe a presidential contender, we shall see, will be one of the speakers. So just know that the cathedral is trying to pay attention to some of these issues as well. And when John and Margaret and Doug asked me if I would speak, I knew the topic was civility, but they asked me if I would put a particular focus on forgiveness and reconciliation. I can't imagine why. And so this afternoon, I want to approach this from a few different perspectives. First, looking at the landscape as I think we encounter it today, and looking at, is this new? Or is it just perfectly dreadful at this point in time? And then focus a little bit on where forgiveness falls into, and reconciliation falls into this conversation, and that's where I will end. But in looking at the current landscape, I recently read an article that I found fascinating in National Geographic. And the author is Agustin Fuentes, who is a professor of anthropology at Notre Dame. And the article is entitled, "Are We as Awful as We Act Online?" That got my attention. And let me give you fair warning. His article starts off with a quote that was posted on Facebook, and it's really pretty awful. But that sort of sets the stage for where we find ourselves. And I quote, "You need to have your throat cut out and your decomposing, bug-infested body fed to wild pigs." That was an anonymous Facebook post, and there was more that's unprintable, sent to Kyle Edmund after the British pro tennis player lost in the 2017 tournament. I mean, really? I mean, John Dalton can get pretty invested in Navy winning, but I mean, that's just off the chart. Fuentes goes on to say that the internet is a particularly volatile place of late. Aggression on social media has reached such a pinnacle of acrimony that some U.S. House members proposed designating an annual National Day of Civility. The proposal drew civil responses, but also tweets and posts of wrath, ridicule, and profanity. As an evolutionary anthropologist, Fuentes posits the view that this British behavior is not because of social media. He says that over millions of years, humanity evolved from ape-like beings with sticks and rocks to creators of cars, rockets, art, nations, etc. So how did this happen? Fuentes posits a view that our brains got bigger and our capacity for cooperation exploded. That we are, in fact, wired to work together, to forge diverse social relationships, and to creatively problem solve together. Fuentes argues that the increase in online aggression is due to an explosive combination of this human evolutionary social skill set, the social media boom, and the specific political and economic context in which we find ourselves, a combination that's opened up a space for more and more people to fan the flames of aggression and insult online. He goes on to explain that how we perceive, experience, and act in the world is intensely shaped by who and what surround us on a daily basis. Our families, communities, institutions, beliefs, and role models. The who we interact with has been changing. Today, the who can include more virtual social media friends than physical ones. More information absorbed via Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram than in physical social experiences, and more pronouncements from ad-sponsored 24-hour news outlets than from conversations with other human beings. Historically, we've maintained harmony by displaying compassion and geniality, and by fostering connectedness when we get together. Conversely, anonymity and the lack of face-to-face interaction on social media platforms removes a crucial part of the equation of human sociality, and that opens the door to more frequent and severe displays of aggression. It's a little bit like Doug was referencing, that when you can get isolated and lonely, some wacky stuff can happen. So what's the alternative? How do we move past this current state of tit for tat? On social media, where the troll is remote and anonymous, even the best intentioned individual challenge may devolve into a shouting match. But condoning the bully with a group action, a reasoned communal response rather than a knee-jerk solo gesture, can be more effective at shutting down aggression. Fuentes cites the example of the students of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, who called out their Twitter trolls and shut them down. Some alt-right hate websites have been taken offline, all because thousands of people stood up to them and said, "No more." More recently, I would cite the overwhelming response of people across this country and the globe looking at the policy of this administration of separating children from their families at the border. People stood up and said, "No more," and the policy was reversed. Fuentes challenges us to do the difficult social work our contemporary world demands. That means standing up against bullying, abuse, and aggressive harassment. Never forget that we, the people, do have power. Is this the worst it's ever been? I turn to John Meacham, who argues no in his new book, The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. He writes, this book is a portrait of hours in which the politics of fear were prevalent, a reminder that periods of public dispiritedness are not new, and a reassurance that they are survivable. In the book, he puts a close correlation between the McCarthy era and some of what we're experiencing today. He writes that there's a natural tendency in American political life to think that things were always better in the past. The passions of previous years fade, to be inevitably replaced by the passions of the present. Nostalgia is a powerful force, and in the maelstrom of the moment, Many of us seek comfort in imagining that once there was a Camelot, without quite remembering that the Arthurian legend itself was about a court riven by ambition and infidelity. America's been defined by a sense of its own exceptionalism, an understanding of destiny that has also been tempered by an appreciation of the tragic nature of life. Quoting theologian Reinhold Niebuhr in 1944, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. We try, we fail, but we must try again and again and again, for only in trial is progress possible. Meacham offers the following in the conclusion of his book. Number one, enter the arena. The battle begins with political engagement itself. Pay attention, express an opinion, and for heaven's sakes, vote. Number two, resist tribalism. Don't let any single cable network or Twitter feed tell you what to think. Number three, respect facts and deploy reason. In other words, keep an open mind. Number four, find a critical balance. Being informed is more than knowing details and arguments. It also entails being humble enough to recognize that only on the rarest of occasions does any single camp have a monopoly on virtue or on wisdom. Fifth and final, keep history in mind. He writes brilliantly, a grasp of the past can be orienting. And he quotes Mark Twain, who said, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. He lifts up the past to show us that survivability is possible. And it ends on a message of hope, which is where most preachers want to end. Now, I would be remiss, having touched on the sociological aspects of where we are in time and space and a historical look, without mentioning, as we move into forgiveness, that forgiveness is not just a good thing to do, it's good for you. So, particularly with my wonderful internist, Dr. Dan Young here, let me talk about the health benefits of forgiveness. According to a Johns Hopkins expert in the field, conflict doesn't just weigh down the spirit, it can lead to physical health issues. Whether it's a simple spat with your spouse or long-held resentment toward a family member or friend, unresolved conflict can go deeper than you may realize. It may affect your physical health. Studies have found that the act of forgiveness can reap huge rewards for your health, lowering the risk of heart attack, improving cholesterol levels and sleep, and reducing pain, blood pressure, and levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. And research, good news for the boomers and beyond, research points to an increase in the forgiveness health connection as you age. Studies have found that some people are just naturally more forgiving. Consequently, they tend to be more satisfied with their lives and have less depression, anxiety, stress, anger, and hostility. People who hang on to grudges, however, are more likely to experience severe depression and PTSD as well as other health conditions. That doesn't mean they can't train themselves to act in healthier ways. In fact, 62% of American adults say they need more forgiveness in their personal lives. Now, I had to ask, why isn't it 100%? But I digress. It ends with saying, forgiveness is a choice. So, how do we forgive? I will say, as a Christian, I bring that lens to this question. And some of the best-known passages in the New Testament of forgiveness are in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Around the 15th verse, Jesus is teaching the disciples, and he tells them, if you have a broken relationship that needs reconciliation, you take the initiative. It doesn't matter if you were the one who was wronged or the one who caused the breach. Take the initiative. Now, most of us know when we've caused hurt or damaged a relationship. But sometimes we actually don't. And taking the initiative is so important. Let me just speak to a personal experience of my own. Some years ago, a beloved mentor and friend of mine from a previous church life asked me if I could get something accomplished for him. And at the time, I was in lay leadership at my church. And he knew and I knew that it was going to be a real challenge to get that done. But nevertheless, I told him I would try. And it involved changing the mind of another person. And I knew that was going to be really difficult. And so I quietly went about the business of trying to make this thing happen. And I was not having success. And I enlisted the support of some of the former leaders in the church to help me with it. And they quietly gave it their best effort. And again, no success. I kept thinking and I kept praying that the heart would be softened. And so I never gave up hope. But time passed. And after about a year, my beloved mentor and friend asked if he could come to see me. And when we got together, he told me how badly I had hurt him. And he couldn't believe that after he'd laid his heart on the table, that I hadn't done anything. You see, my sin was really one of omission. In trying to protect his feelings and the other people involved, I had not given him a non-progress report, if you will. I had tried to spare him those feelings, but the end result was that he thought I had not done anything. And I was so grateful that he came to me and lifted that up and had the courage to tell me how badly I had hurt him, because it gave us a chance to reconcile. And he died 2 months later. Take the initiative. Take the initiative. In one of the seminal second teachings in that 18th chapter, wonderful Peter, whom I just love. Peter so often stepped in it, You got to love the guy. Often wrong, never in doubt. And he's talking to Jesus, and you could just see him pulling himself up to his full height, asking, so, how many times are we supposed to forgive? As many as 7? And Jesus says, no. Try 70 times 7, essentially meaning infinity. Now, in fairness to Peter, in the rabbinic tradition, you were required to forgive 3 times. And so Peter doubles it and adds a little bit to it, so you can sort of understand how he thought that was such a magnanimous thing. But Jesus' response essentially points out that he's asking the wrong question. It's not a quantity question. It's a quality question. How you live your life matters. Forgiveness is not easy. We know that. If it were easy, I doubt it would be mentioned in the New Testament over 75 times. It's something we all struggle with. And as I've read about it and prayed about it over the years, one of the best lens that helped me in terms of moving toward forgiveness was offered by a Roman Catholic philosopher, theologian, and humanitarian by the name of Jean Vanier. You may know of him. He was the founder of a community called the Ark. Some 50-plus years ago, Vanier founded a community where adults choose to live with people with intellectual disabilities. And today, there are those communities all over the globe. I think there are 2 in Washington. And what Vanier writes about in his book, Becoming Human, is that the 50-plus years that he's lived with people with intellectual disabilities have taught him really what it means to be human, that they have taught him to recognize and accept his own weaknesses, his own vulnerabilities, as well as his gifts. That people with intellectual disabilities can only be who they really are. They don't put on masks or present differently than who they are. They're all heart and all trust. And in his book, Becoming Human, the last chapter is dedicated to forgiveness. And he offers 3 basic principles for being on the road to forgiveness, and I offer them to you. Number 1, each and every person has value, and we share a common humanity. Each and every person has value, and we share a common humanity. Think about a year ago when hurricanes Harvey and Irma, etc., wreaked havoc over the South and Puerto Rico. And what did you see on your TV screens and your tablets? You saw neighbor helping neighbor. White, brown, black, it didn't matter. Rich, poor. No one asked anyone's political affiliation or lack thereof, their religious affiliation or lack thereof. People were in need, and people responded. Each and every person has value, and we share a common humanity. Second, we have to believe that each person is capable of change, and we have to believe in the possibility of human redemption. People can change, and human redemption is always possible with God's help. I'm reminded of a story that a member of our cathedral congregation shared with me once. This man's very involved in prison ministry, and he shares the story of a man who was part of the men's group that my friend Ford had been working with. And this was a big, tough guy who had brutally murdered a man and had been on death row pretty much all of his adult life. Twice he'd been scheduled for execution, and twice his execution was stayed. The third date came up, and he was told, there's no option at this point, and he knew it was going to go through. And after years of being in this men's group, he decided that he would do something that was very terrifying for him. He wrote a letter to the woman whose husband he'd brutally murdered, and he asked for her forgiveness, not because he deserved it, but he wanted to reconcile this one open chapter in his life. The time came for his execution, and miraculously, at the last second, it was commuted. He was going to live. And so he joined this men's group, and he held up an envelope, and he said, she wrote back. And he was too afraid to open up the envelope because he knew what he deserved. He'd done nothing to merit the forgiveness that he asked for. And so another man opened up the envelope and read, I forgave you 20 years ago, and I've been praying for you every day since. We have to believe that each person is capable of change, and that human redemption is possible. Third and finally, at our core, we long for peace and unity. We know that, don't we? Who wants to live with broken relationships in a broken world? We long for unity and peace in our lives, in our land, in the global community. I'm reminded of the miracle in South Africa. Who could have imagined, in the midst and height of apartheid, that they would find unity and peace one with another? Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, helped to make that miracle possible. Samuel Chadwick once wrote that it's a wonder what God can do with a broken heart if God gets all the pieces. Toward the end of his book, Vanier quotes German theologian Geico Müller-Fahrenholtz, who writes about forgiveness, and I quote, "In the last resort, humans cannot define what constitutes their humanity. It transcends them. As we work for forgiveness, we're called to reflect that as human beings, each of us is created in the image of God, the most merciful. That is our calling, our mission, to become mirrors of mercy." I believe all of this is possible with God's help. It's reputed that Gandhi once said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." Thank you.